Hi, morning. With the rise of the trend of violence against women during COVID-19, active bystanders are needed more than ever. If you don't know what an active bystander is, stick around as we will be discussing how you can take a stand against gender based violence in Trinidad and Tobago with Dr. Ann Barratt. We'll be right back.
Your strategy has to involve your mindset, and your strategy then involves the actions that you take to move you from where you are to where you want to be.
I'll start with what Visa isn't, right? Visa doesn't issue credit card. We don't issue credit. So Visa doesn't do that, which surprises a lot of people.
We'll use a phrase like, well, things changed, but things don't change. People change things. All the legislation that has been passed, somebody advocated for that. And so International Women's Day is to commemorate that history of women making change.
Several of the banks have started to migrate their existing debit card portfolio to chip and pin EMV technology. So the SMEs are going to benefit from a wide range of customers who previously did not have a credit card, but only had a debit card.
Good morning, and welcome to the live series Straight Off the Bat, a show that covers the need to revive and survive and adapt to the new normal of COVID-19. Join us on Thursdays as we speak to individuals across multiple industries who will help you understand financial literacy and education. Today is actually our last show for the year, and it's a very important discussion that I believe has a connection with financial literacy and education, because to be human is to make a lot of errors. So if you're joining us from LinkedIn, thank you so much. Don't forget to like and follow our page to continue seeing content that will help you manage your money. Today, we are discussing how you can take a stand against gender-based violence in Trinidad and Tobago with Dr. Ann Barratt. Dr. Ann Barratt is a lecturer and head at the Institute of Gender and Development Studies at the University of the West Indies campus in St. Augustine. She's a graduate of the University of the West Indies, holding a BA in Media and Communications Studies with Political Science. We had a little conversation earlier about Tobago. We're not going to cover that today, but we are aware of what's happening, right? There's also MA in Communication Studies and PhD Interdisciplinary Gender Studies. Her research areas include human communication conflict, social media use and its implications, mental health, and for today, gender-based violence. She loves gardening and describes herself as a crazy plant lady. So let's see if she has a green thumb. And she also loves to participate in triathlons, which, I mean, that could probably take up this whole conversation because we have so much in common there, especially the swimming portion, which I can't relate. So welcome, Dr. Ann Barratt. How are you this morning?
Thank you very much. I'm good this morning. It's a pleasure to be here with you on this Thursday morning. I'm busy, but I'm excited to have this conversation. So, getting the energy from all the things that we love to do and advocate for. It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. So do you, because I know a lot of people have to be sort of aware of what I'm calling you and respect the amount of time you spent in school. So do I call you Dr. Ann? Do I call you Ann?
You can call me Ann. Many people call me Dr. B, Dr. Sue. My name is Ann. Please feel free to call me by my name. I'm cool.
Okay. Oh, awesome. So when it comes to this acknowledgement of who we are and gender, I feel like gender almost feels like it's been hijacked as a word. So when it comes to your gender studies, can you just give us a little summary of what that looks like?
Sure. Now, just so that we understand, gender is actually a language. I apologize, my email is notifying me. Gender is a language that we took from linguistics to describe the social arrangements for living, for identifying human beings in connection with biological sex. That's the way. So it's the social characteristics, the social expectations that we map onto the human body. Gender then is something that we achieve, something that we create, we define. It is not a pre-existing fact. But it was borrowed from linguistics because it was used to describe different forms of language in terms of English or Spanish or French. And then now, sex was not enough to describe humanity. We have sex, we are biological beings, and we are dichotomous, i.e., we have male and female, and together we procreate to create a new person. So our reproductive biology can describe our bodies, but even that is not, the same for everybody. But we express ourselves, we have a sense of ourselves, we have appearance of ourselves, an embodiment of ourselves in these varying ways. And gender now is a word that allows us to define and describe and illustrate those elements of the human.
So that's basically, well, I feel like I'm getting a field lecture here.
Yes.
When it comes to this phrase, gender is a social construct. It is a social construct. That's literally what you've said there. And for those who may have missed it, we tend to assign a color. Let's say, if it's a girl, as some of us are aunties. So you have to go get things for the mom. And it's like, if it's a girl, get pink. If it's a boy, it's blue. When it comes to that social construct, what are some of the pitfalls of that association when it comes to gender?
Oh my, there are a lot. So on the pink and blue, just as an aside, for a long time before, I can't give you the exact time, like let's say late 19th century or somewhere around there. For a long time, it was the opposite. Blue was for girls because it was considered gentle and quiet, and pink was for boys because it was considered loud and assertive. And then that shifted. And I pointed that aside because there are two things. Gender being a social construct, basically constituted within language and reinforced through behavior and prescriptions and norms and beliefs and attitudes, is really just a creation. We as human beings agree that things about people would have meaning based on their role, either in terms of how we reproduce and our productive labor. So, reproductive and productive labor. Where gender can become distorted and have real troublesome consequences, as well as can be privileging for some, if not all, is when we think about the implications for one's capacity to be, the implications for who we can be, how we can be, where, and with what effect. Gender is real in its consequences, like race and ethnicity and class. These are things that we construct socially, and if we unpackage them, they don't actually have any sort of sustained meaning or sustained consistency over time. But when we apply that meaning to our lives and reinforce it and reproduce it and reinscribe it, then it has real consequences. So in terms of gender, what it does, it can have a limiting effect, and I'll count them down. It can have a limiting effect in the sense that depending on how you're defined in terms of masculinity or femininity, you are included in one set of behaviors, but excluded from another based on just what we presume should be. It's a should. Secondly, it shapes how we present and express ourselves, either in terms of how we resist the limits or how we comply with the limits. Gender, at the same time, assigns power in asymmetrical or unequal ways. We suggest that people perform certain roles in relation to their reproductive biology, and as a result, you should desire in particular ways. And depending on who and how you desire, in what contexts, you are more legitimate than others. You should perform particular roles in the public sphere, in industry. You should have, we were talking about financial management. You should have control over decision making, access to resources, and distribution of those resources because of this perception of your role and what you do and your capacity. So gender then becomes very real in its consequences. It also influences how people can enact themselves, as they say, to borrow somebody, becomes legible as human. And once you are not legible according to cultural norms, which are just trends that exist in majorities and not sustained concrete fact, but are reproduced and reinforced as such, you could be erased as existing. Your entire existence can be erased because someone says, I choose not to recognize you. So I would say that the reason why we spend a lot of time contemplating gender is that the consequences it has for our lives in terms of power relations, in terms of capacity to act, in terms of access to resources and freedoms and rights and so forth are very, very real.
That is so interesting. That comment you made about the blue and the pink being, what it is. I'm like, what? History is so repetitive. So when it comes to that assignment of power, let's shift the discussion across to the gender-based violence, because we've had guests in the past where we've identified there are a lot of folks who are losing their jobs or have lost their jobs, and there's this sort of the walls are closing in on you feeling, and then with that there's an increase of violence. So for those who don't know, with the term, what does it mean when you say gender-based violence?
Okay, gender-based violence is very literal. It means that violence is perpetrated, directed, expressed, sanctioned, supported in ways, diminished, etc., against a person or group of persons based on their gender or based on their status or role they occupy or identity positioning that they occupy in a hierarchy, i.e., an arrangement or a system that says this is how you will exercise your reproductive labor or your productive labor. In other words, let me translate that. When we think of gender-based violence, we think about all of those meanings, those roles, those identities that we say people should have because of this social construct as it connects to the biological. All of those things become a site of violence, either considered disciplinary, reinforcing, containing, diminishing, or judgments. So gender-based violence is not just human conflict. It says talk about human conflict is to suggest that there's this kind of neutral dysfunctionality. No, it is triggered and fed and reinforced by particular views about femininities and masculinities, and the women, men, non-conforming, whether in terms of woman, man, or masculinity and femininity, these perceptions about who you are and who you can be in terms of this gender and how you are then disciplined, controlled, etc., as I've said before. So really and truly, gender-based violence is targeted violence. Just like when we talk about racism, is targeted violence, or classism is targeted violence rooted in class or race or ethnicity or religion. Similarly for gender, it's not just people being frustrated and having dysfunctional conflict. It's that you express some form of violence to some degree because of how you perceive masculine and feminine identities and roles.
This is an interesting conversation because I've had in my circle, in my group, anytime some assignment to a role of a gender comes up, everybody kind of stares at me. I'm like, oh boy, what's Pauline going to say? This idea of a woman supposed to be in the kitchen and cooking and so forth. And then there are also folks who express this sort of, well, you know what? Men have it hard too. So there's this either or. And when it comes to this gender-based violence conversation, why is it important to separate that conversation?
Two things I would say, just to reinforce at the beginning. You can't compare victimhood, and we must not do it. One. So when people say, oh, well, gender-based violence, statistically, we see across the globe, affects women and girls more so than men and boys. But, what about the men, and men have it hard? That's a problem. That's a problem because of one, you're trying to compare victimhoods when circumstances and status and privilege and subordination is very different, and it's inequitable and unequal. Two, it's also a sort of a backlash. Okay, we want to focus on those who have long been subordinated and diminished, and it makes you uncomfortable, and therefore you try to undermine the conversation and the focus of that conversation, because there's an underlying presumption, whether the person is aware of overtly or not, that this group does not deserve this sort of attention. So one has to confront the implicit biases around saying, well, men have it hard too. Of course, everyone has it hard in some way, but the experience that those groups that are constantly vulnerable based on the way we have structured our society, the experience of those people are in no way to be diminished because there are instances of the alternatives, right? And the need to distinguish is in order to pay attention to those points where the source of our problems, the source of our concern, the source of our moral panic keeps reproducing itself. So, for example, we may all feel appalled if we see a woman is killed, yet another one today. Or we may all feel appalled if there is a public, sexual violence or murder or something like that against a woman or a girl. We may even feel appalled if we see a man is killed in the context of, let's say, a domestic violence situation, which is very, very rare, incidentally. But we are not willing to confront the fact that, going back to what I just said about the rarity of men being killed in this domestic violence context, we are not willing to confront the fact that we are all complicit as bystanders in reproducing the violence that women and girls experience, be it sexual or physical or financial or whatever. And we're not willing to confront the fact that we have to disrupt what we take for granted as moral, as right, as normative. So it is important that when we think about it, we distinguish between people generally experience varying degrees of violence or subordination, depending on where they sit on society, and systematic structural arrangements that subject groups, particularly women and girls, members of the LGBTQI community, the disabled, the elderly, systematically reinforce and reproduce your vulnerability to violence.
When you made that comment about not comparing your victimhood, it just brought me right back to my parents when you express some form of, okay, I'm experiencing this thing, and then the response will, well, back in my day, I'd be like, okay, I had to go and walk 2 miles with 2 pail buckets of water, based on a true story, to ensure that we have water at home, right? Well, back in my day, I had to do 10 miles, So do you see that similarity when we start comparing that well, I had it harder than you?
Of course. And this is something that people do across multiple contexts. Think about something like punishment of kids or sexuality education or choices to leave or stay at home or choice of career or education or all of these things. People say, well, in my day, this is what obtained and this is the truth. You have it easy because it's different from mine. The truth is that every generation, every family, every context varies. And one set of experiences, there's no basis that one is more legitimate than the other. We respond to how people live across contexts. And so we are compelled, and I'm not a psychologist to say why we are so compelled. I could just suggest that we are compelled because we make sense of reality through our lived experience. We make sense of reality through our observations. And so if we see it and we feel it and we live it, it appears rational to us. We rationalize those experiences as substantive. But just because somebody else has a different set of experiences, we're like, well, then yours is not reality because it's not rational to our experiences. So I can suggest that that's why they do it. But I would discourage people from doing that. What I would encourage, and as you know, my substantive position is communication, is that let's say you're in a family and you have kids and you're saying, hey, you need to get up and sweep the yard. And the child says, oh, I feel it so much. Oh my God, whatever. And then you say, shut up. I used to have to sweep and paint and do this and that. I walk 10 miles and you only have to walk 2. You have a conversation about why it's important to do something. You have a conversation about what is the significance, and you don't make somebody feel diminished because they're different. That's one. And that applies to everything. It could be in terms of how you discipline. It could be in terms of how you see identity. If you allow me to get into some of the uncomfortable things, sometimes people say, what is the world coming to? People are normalizing these alternatives. People are normalizing things that are immoral, right? And you say, when? In what way? What are you suggesting obtain in the past, and what past are you referring to? And what are you seeing now? So sometimes people are only seeing through, again, that lens of experience. So yes, that is a problem, because it now erases the capacity of the new experiencing subject to say, my life is legitimate. And it also says that there's only one way of viewing the world, which is not true. We all live different ways and times change. The most important thing, I think, is that it is a mechanism. Remember, I keep saying that there's a structure and a system. These are mechanisms to reinforce the dominant meanings that we said should have meaningfulness. These are the mechanisms through we say, this is how you know what you know. This is what you can know. And if I keep reproducing the conditions of knowing, then we will continue to be what we have always been. But when you introduce a different way of knowing things and doing things, it creates discomfort. And then is when you have these moments of, no. Don't quarrel. It's just 2 miles. Really and truly, the standard is 10 miles. Right? So I think that is something that we need to disrupt, and we need to encourage dialogue, respectful discussion across the board, across context, parent, child, husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever, boss, employee, and governments, states, and their citizens. We need to be able to have these conversations.
I always find it interesting when there's the conversation around lifestyle and, how men are dressed in a specific way. And I'm just like, have you not read history? There's this movie called Amadeus about Mozart. And it's just like everybody's makeup and like wigs. And, it's so interesting that you mentioned that social construct, because it's so specific to an era, and it's important for us to learn about our history. And I want to talk about the connection with our mental health as well, because I don't think we truly understand how these things affect us. But we're going to cover that right after the break.
But that was like my first experience with money. Very, very first experience.
I've been in banking since I was a teenager.
And welcome back to Straight Off the Bat, a show that covers the need to revive and survive and adapt to a new normal of COVID-19. Oh, gosh, throwing me off today. If you're joining us from YouTube, thank you so much. Don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe to our page to continue seeing content that'll help you manage your money. And trust me when I say I've scoured the internet. You can't find these conversations anywhere else, especially when it comes to Trinidad and Tobago. We are a unique place. Today, we are discussing how you can take a stand against gender-based violence in Trinidad and Tobago with Dr. Ann Barratt. She is a lecturer and the head of Institute of Gender and Development Studies at the University of the West Indies campus in St. Augustine. So welcome back to Ann. And, we're going to have this discussion around mental health, because mental health in general has become a trending word. It's just like, I'm going to have a mental health day. I still think there's a divide between the age groups, but when it comes to gender-based violence, what are the effects, or what is the number one thing that we should be aware of when it comes to women and mental health?
Oh my God, this is a complex and pressing issue, I would suggest. Now, gender-based violence I think that there is a ripple-on effect. When one finds oneself subject to, as I said, targeted violence, based on who you are supposed to be, the roles you perform, the identities you are expected to express, whether it's in the home or the workplace or in public, this then becomes this targeted violence, be it physical, emotional, psychological, whatever, can then influence how you see yourself, how you see yourself in relation to others, how you see your value, how you understand reality, how you see the capacity for doing and being, how you see your capacity or your right to refusal, how you see the potential to live a livable life, how you see the functionality of your lives and the worth of being. And in all of those influencing places, all those areas of influence, it can then have an effect on the stability of your emotional response, your psychological response, your relational understanding of yourself. All of these things come together and can lead to a number of varying mental health conditions or disorders. They can also be triggering for pre-existing mental health conditions and disorders that you may have had, but there was not that catalyst moment, be it experiential or even biological, that would have triggered it. And so when we think about violence, from the physical to the social, to the psychological, to other all forms I'm talking about, I'm speaking in very general terms, so we see the connection. We need to think about the ripple on effect. So let me give an example. You may have a woman who's working, she has a family, and she's productive, and she's doing what she has to do. Let's say she experiences gaslighting on a daily basis or on a frequent basis, maybe once a week, whatever. And I'm not even putting in physical. She experiences gaslighting in her household from her partner. And she manages this all the time. And it creates gaslighting has a tendency to create a lot of doubt, a lot of questioning of reality. She manages this and she deals with what she has to deal with. Then she moves and she has to engage with her peers, her children, her co-workers, her other family members, the public, wherever. If you are in a position, a state of mind where you are you find yourself in a persistent state of doubt, or your self-esteem is drawn into question, undermined, or you are unclear of your functionality, how then do you think that person translates themselves across these other contexts, in the workplace, in the public place, with their friends and family and their kids and so forth? So their roles that they perform are implicated, mediated by this moment of gaslighting, just by way of an example, of course. So women who experience, and as we know, women in the majority experience gender-based violence in the private, and in terms of particularly sexual violence and sexism and sexual harassment in the public. And I speak not to the exclusion of anybody else, but I'm speaking in terms of the majority. You then find yourself subject to these moments of uncertainty, moments of threat. There is an author whose name is escaping me right now, who says one of the greatest forms of violence that women live with on a daily basis and learn to live with and come habituated to is a persistent sense of being under threat. I have to go think about it this way, and the discourse of personal responsibility. Park your car in the right place. Walk and look about. Check the taxi driver before you take. Look behind you. Don't take the wrong drink. Don't smile too much. Don't be on your phone. Be alert. Do all of these things, which women are constantly encouraged to do to protect themselves, which suggests that you are living in a world out in both private and public space that by default is violent against you. Contemplating that reality and adding incidents of real violence against the person, some more than others, you can see how depression might set in. You could see how other forms of mental health disorders or mental health conditions come to the fore. But there's another complication. When you live in a society like ours, where mental health remains stigmatized, where mental health comes up against religious beliefs and the ideas about religiosity and spirituality, where there is difficulty separating these ideas, then health-seeking behaviors are undermined. And so you may be creating conditions of hopelessness, or you may be creating conditions of faking strength, or all different types of things. So what the point I'm trying to make is that violence and the person who experiences that violence, both structurally and interpersonally, are constantly at risk of having their mental health be a source of great vulnerability.
It's interesting and timely because was living in a specific apartment with a roommate, a male roommate, and there was this particular thing where he never used to lock the front door. And I got upset. I shared, hey, you can't just keep doing this. His response was, oh, big deal. They'll just rob us. And that disconnect wasn't apart the first time. It took me a little while to really digest that, because there's lack of understanding, because he's not seeing it from my perspective, because it's not just being robbed. I don't think every woman out there know exactly how I felt. And changing my location and recently moving, I had a really nice sleep. Like, I was just like, wait a minute, I was missing out on this sleep for so long. And you've grown so accustomed to the outside world telling you how you're supposed to feel. That conversation around mental health, I think, is so important, because it leads into how you deal with your friends, your family, your finances, because I found myself trying to escape with Amazon.com.
Or
Yes. Things that I keep looking around and I'm like, why am I still feeling the way I'm still feeling?
Exactly.
So I think this may have turned into a therapy session.
I think a good exercise for listeners to practice, and I always do it with my students, so that people see the disconnect in terms of how we live violence and how we live violence differently. I always ask a simple question. When you get up in the morning and you're about to leave your house, map what you do from the moment you step off your bed to the moment you get to your destination. What is involved in your day? I'm getting ready to go about. Think of you walking on the street, driving your car, taking transport, or driving yourself or whatever. Think of the steps you take and what you consider, and map it out, and then compare notes. And people always see that women and men have a different reality. And it's even different if you are transgender or gender non-conforming. You have another layer to consider when you are getting up to go out for your day, wherever you may be going. And I think that that's a huge thing that that we have to acknowledge. The specter of sexual violence and sexual harassment is very, very real for when you occupy a feminine body. And not that those who occupy masculine bodies are excluded, but it is something that you know from girlhood, childhood, that the specter of sexual violence is a reality and it's not going to go anywhere. The challenge for bystanders is, are you going to confront the source of that specter in order to initiate behavior change?
I think we definitely need to expand more on the bystander conversation, because a lot of times, as you mentioned earlier, you see the world through your own lenses, and empathy for some reason has become a rarity, especially with social media. So we want to talk a little bit more about the bystander and how you can help right after the break.
Sure.
Welcome back to Straight Off the Bat, a show that covers the need to revive, survive, and adapt to the new normal of COVID-19. If you're joining us from Facebook, smash that follow button, and don't forget to subscribe to our page to continue seeing our content that'll help you manage your money and, based on the discussion today, your mental health. Today, we're discussing how you can take a stand against gender-based violence in Trinidad and Tobago with Dr. Ann Barratt. Her research areas include human communication conflict, which with the anti-vax conversation is so important now with social media use and its implications, mental health, and gender-based violence. Now, before the break, we were discussing bystanders, and I'm going to quote you here, Suan, about thinking outside of the box to make the invisible visible, because a lot of times we think, well, that didn't happen to me, so it's not a problem. We wait till some connection by one degree. But at the end of the day, this is all affecting us. So when it comes to being a bystander, what is your role to reduce the gender-based violence?
Okay. Now, first of all, I want to pick up on the word empathy. Before the break, you were saying, it seems as if empathy has disappeared or doesn't seem to exist in the hearts and minds of a lot of people. If we look at social media, and we're thinking both in terms of gender-based violence, we're thinking in terms of the current insecurity around COVID-19 and those who are affected, around climate change, around food insecurity, around so many other things, employment, job insecurity, everything that we're living in the most profound ways. And I think that before I even say what you can do, I would say that we live in this kind of strange circumstance where the bystander effect presumes that somebody else will do it through what is defined as diffusion of responsibility. We say, okay, I don't have to do anything. I don't have to intervene. I don't have to say anything. I don't have to act. I don't have to do nothing because there are others who can take responsibility for this effect. So you see an incident, I'm not going to intervene. Let somebody else do it. Or if there's a group, or you see someone saying, wear your mask and protect the other person. I don't have to do that. I have choice over myself. Somebody else will take responsibility. Or you have never lived gender-based violence in your house, let's say domestic violence or intimate partner violence. Oh, I don't know anything about that. That's not part of my reality. Somebody else will deal with it. So there is this diffusion of responsibility that disrupts the ideal of empathy, empathy being something that we are taught to be part of our humanity. We do unto others as we'd have them do unto you. So we, as a principle, and so we understand somebody else's experiences and reality and respond to it in an empathetic way, a way of recognizing and a way of sharing meaning and understanding. When it comes to gender-based violence, a lot of times the bystander diffuses responsibility, responds to groupthink, look into the rest of the group to see what is going on before they act based on what their threshold is, what their instinct is, or they decide that they don't want to put themselves out there. And there are legitimate reasons for this. It could be fear. It could be that they have experienced some degree of trauma, and so they might expect an outcome based on their experience that prompts them not to act because they think that the outcome that they had, which may have been dysfunctional, will occur. Or a person may not know what to do or how to take it further. They feel impotent because they don't know what to do with the situation. Another reason may be they have tried to intervene in the past and they didn't get the desired outcome. So they are impatient or they have resigned themselves to circumstances. For example, your neighbor might have been experiencing domestic violence. You called the police once, the police came and the person said, no, it's okay. I don't want to call. It's all right. And you said, but look how I tried to help. Whatever those circumstances come into play, the bystander has to then go against that instinct to diffuse responsibility, to distance oneself, saying that the group, some person in the group will take responsibility, and understand your power to initiate change from below, as in from the community level. You can choose to intervene in a number of ways, and it's called the 4 Ds. And if someone searches the internet very quickly and look at how you can communicate and participate to help folks, you'll find it. But the 4 Ds is a practice for bystander intervention. You can directly intervene in something. You see something happening, let's say sexual harassment on the street. You can say, hey, let's say another man to another man, or a woman can come and say, hey, come here, come over here. Or for example, and when I was in university, I remember we used to party a lot, don't tell the lecturers. And if we go to a party and you see somebody trying to take advantage of somebody who's a little bit drunk, You pull this person, whether they're a friend or not, and say, come dance with us. You have directly intervened without creating conflict. Or you use these methods of interpersonal communication. It takes some maturity in order to know how to read the situation, but that's an option, direct intervention. You can also connect it to what I was just saying. You can distract, draw somebody's attention away. Like you see someone having a quarrel in public, a couple, or a parent with a child or something, and you see that it is escalating, and you're like, this is going to end badly. You don't have to go give an order. Hey, stop what you're doing. That mightn't work out. You can say, hey, you want to do so and so? Hey, come look at so and so. Where you find a way to distract someone so that it creates a gap, a pause to de-escalate the situation. So these are little practical interventions. Now, not everything is like that. Not everything works that way. Sometimes your direct intervention, call the police or seek help from someone else or alert the public or something like that. I remember my grandmother used to say from very early, if you see something happening, especially let's say it's sexual violence, scream fire, and that will bring people in to help, more bystanders, because people will, the bystander effect doesn't have the same effect because people say, oh, if I could affect me. So it's not about empathy, it's about self-interest. She used to be like, if somebody's going to attack in the road, scream fire. So that is another way of intervening. You can also delegate or recruit help. So I kind of said that already. That's a third D. You encourage people to seek the authority. And in this modern time with social media, don't videotape the person getting, like, we've had videos, somebody getting beat with a shovel or planas or kick up or whatever, with a cutlass, planas with a cutlass or kick up. No. You pause in there to videotape this because, and then you try to rationalize to yourself saying, I'm collecting evidence. No, you are a voyeur to the violence. Now, if you are collecting evidence, you're saying, I'm going to videotape this and it has its utility, then recruit help. Hey, I'm getting, call the police, call whomever, get help, so-and-so. If there's nobody to get help, you try to be a person of help if you can. And then, of course, you can delay. There might be a circumstance that's taking place, and you realize that immediate intervention might be detrimental to the person who is at risk. So you take a little time, you seek advice, you find a place that someone can go when you actually intervene. And I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. When I was young, I saw this movie called The Burning Bed. I was maybe 11 or 10 or something like that. It was on Lifetime. So you know what kind of movie it is. And there was this woman who was experiencing horrible domestic violence, and she wanted to leave for her kids and so forth. And she waited. And this was her, the victim, or I should say survivor, making a strategic decision. So she said, okay, I know that I have to escape, but I know the circumstances for my escape are important because I can fail. Now, she committed a crime where she kind of killed the husband, so I'm not advocating that at all. But she waited until there was a moment where her attacker was vulnerable. He was drunk and couldn't act against her. And then she escaped with her children, and then the crime happened. So we leave the crime, I won't mention it. The point is sometimes you have to do the same. You might have a family member or a best friend or a coworker who's going through something. Sometimes you have to take time to understand the details of the situation, the implications of your intervention, and the implications of acting. What are the consequences of acting? You delay your intervention a little bit. So you can have direct, you can distract, you can delegate, seeking help, recruiting help from those who can, or you can delay and then seek support. Because when we diffuse responsibility and in essence turn a blind eye, pretend that we don't see anything, not only are we not practicing empathy, we are sanctioning the behavior. We're saying, yes, let it continue because nobody said anything. Everybody just kind of pretend that it's okay. So I think bystanders have a great deal of power to socialize peer groups, communities, families about what behavior should obtain. And so we must take that responsibility to exercise that power and work for our community, be it very small or larger.
You mentioned Lifetime there, which is a part of 80s babies growing up. We were fed a lot of, there's a specific type of movie that made Lifetime back in the day.
Mhm.
And I can't help but make some kind of comparison because, we mentioned earlier about the whole victimhood and this idea of what exactly is gender-based violence, because we have this sort of extreme. I'm not diminishing because it's obviously important, but there's usually this association with somebody having a black eye, missing teeth. And if you're not to that extreme, then it's not considered violence. So is there a specific sort of threshold of understanding to know, okay, this is not okay?
Yes. Gender-based violence, as I said, remember, it's targeted based on someone's perception of your gender identity, expression, role, or relationships, right? Based on those. But it's any form of harmful act that makes a person feel unsafe, vulnerable, under threat. So it could be physical, it could be emotional, it could be psychological, any form that makes a person feel under threat or vulnerable. And I'll give an example of where this manifests in popular culture. On Netflix, there's a show called Maid. I believe it's called Maid, if I'm correct. And
Yeah.
yes. And that show, the woman who is the star of the show, she left her house because she was experiencing gender-based violence, intimate partner violence. Now, for a large part, she was not physically assaulted. There was the threat of physical assault, but she didn't go through it. But it was financial, it was emotional, it was psychological, it was in terms of the parenting the child and access to the child. It extended to a degree of family violence that was all psychological and emotional. And I think that if someone wants to understand the nuance, that show does well to kind of depict it. People like to be able to see something. And I think that it does, in a dramatized way, of course, kind of show a range. That's one example. The other thing one needs to think about is that sometimes that gender-based violence does not start off at the extreme in most cases. The most extreme being death, right? Or severe bodily harm. Gender-based violence, especially in the home, it starts off gradually. And there are freedoms that are taken away gradually or abruptly sometimes. There are measures and controls put in place. There are different forms of either verbal, physical, psychological, sexual that are exercised over time, and there's a pullback. And then it escalates and escalates into intimate terrorism and the extremes. So we need to understand that when you are confronting gender-based violence, when you reach to the most extreme, it's too late because you have gotten to the point where it would have escalated over time. So people always ask, why do people choose the wrong partners? Or why do people get involved with these people? Can they choose better? And you say to yourself, you don't choose somebody who is horrible to you. You would have chosen, and I'm speaking about intimate partner violence now because that's the context where a lot of gender-based violence takes place. You choose somebody who would have impressed you, they would have charmed you, they would have been special, you fell in love, or you found that you can affiliate with that person. But over time, it escalates and it takes different forms. There's always a grooming period. If we think about what happens with children, children then find themselves again at that point where over time, only in hindsight, you realize the conditions, the felicity conditions that led to different degrees of abuse were mapped, structured, and built and over time. And this happens across contexts. And let's say in terms of parent-child, sometimes parents start off really happy, doing well with their kids, and sometimes they get frustrated as behavior changes. So let's say, and I'm speaking about this too because I want people to understand that when we think about in the private sphere, it includes partners, it includes elders, it includes kids, it includes parents, grandparents, everybody. We need to think of it holistically. If we think about it in the public, like let's say the workplace, because I know you want people to really contemplate their financial management and of course their productive management. in our capitalist world that we live in. If you find yourself experiencing, let's say, sexual harassment in the workplace that affects your, your security and your productivity and your comfort, it starts off small, a little comment, a slight touch, and so forth, and then it escalates. So we have to be willing to not have this response, well, nothing really happened. Why are you complaining? It wasn't nothing. It's not like he raped you. Or it's not like she threw you in the bathroom. That kind of local response. Because it started with that little rub on your hip or that little inappropriate comment. And so we have to be willing to confront the discomfort from early. And so to answer your question very directly, as I've been doing, there isn't a threshold where you say violence begins and stops. The distinguishing thing that I would say is you can have human conflict where we fall out over something. They're your best friend, your sibling, your parent, your partner. People can be engaging with each other and have conflict. That is disagreement, aggression over something we disagree. That's one. Those are usually isolated set of events. Sometimes events come together and merge over time when it remains unresolved. That is different from targeted gender-based violence, which one can imagine is a form of either subtle or extreme terrorism, where the purpose is about control and the purpose is about reinforcing that control, reinforcing that positioning, that status. So it's different from us falling out. Oh God, I can't stand here today. You and I just think. Now, if a fallout leads to me now escalating it and saying that I'm going to continually abuse you, then we have moved from the conflict situation to this targeted form of violence that is, one might say, terrorism. So that is the distinguishing factor. But from the most subtle to the most extreme, as I think MAID tries to draw attention to, gender-based violence takes place.
It's interesting that we have, so much visual content now. So to be able to easily identify that is so important. And I have seen the promotion for the show, and based on the reports, it's been very popular. When it comes to what we've been discussing, the roles and responsibilities of friends and families, where do we start? And I want us to sort of maybe identify some resources as to where we can, help. But we're gonna cover that right after the break. Welcome back to Straight Off the Bat, a show that covers the need to revive, survive, and adapt to new normal of COVID-19. If you're joining us from YouTube, make sure to smash that subscribe button and get notified the next time we go live, which, by the way, it's not going to happen until next year because today is the final show for 2021. And what a year it has been. When it comes to our discussions, I've learned so much, and today it is just as so much to learn. I have my pen and paper all the time, guys. Always so much to learn. Today we're discussing how you can take a stand against gender-based violence in Trinidad and Tobago with Dr. Ann Barratt. So let's close off this session today, because when it comes to gender-based violence and having a discussion, it's uncomfortable. Let's be honest. You really don't want to be part of something that makes us uncomfortable, but to be human is to sometimes be uncomfortable. So we want to ask Suwan, what are the roles and responsibilities? Sorry, where can we find these resources? Because from a neighborhood perspective, I was actually living next to someone who the husband and wife was literally screaming at each other 2-3 o'clock in the morning. And I mean, I'm embarrassed to say I never called because I don't know where to begin. I feel like I'm just part of something. They were there for 20 plus years. I only moved in 2 years. all the neighbors know what's happening. And I just felt like, who am I supposed to call? What is supposed to happen? And are they actually going to show up? And then my neighbor is going to be like, well, she called the police on us. So what are some of the resources available for those who want to be more than just, hey, this is happening, let me remove myself from it?
Right. And that's a very good question. So I think you have different levels of help. You can, now, there are formal documents about referral pathways that have been prepared that someone can then, and I can share that with you. But let me just first categorize sources of help. Let's say within a community or a family or the neighbor and so forth, you can use friend groups, family groups, and kind of have a caucus and come to discuss something with someone. So you have an internal intervention, as it were. Then, of course, you have law enforcement at all levels, where you bring law enforcement if you think it's necessary, and you seek not only the help of law enforcement in order to security intervention and so forth, the support services that law enforcement provides. Then you want to turn to those. So you contact the police, then they send you to victims, witness and support and so forth, where you can get help. But for somebody to take help, they have to be willing to help. So sometimes the first group, family, friends, community, might be very useful to kind of prime someone for an intervention, if that is possible. But again, if you are encountering something in a time of crisis, then law enforcement is your first responder, and of course the ambulance if there is harm or damage. Another layer or another group would be groups, those who work in advocacy and prevention and help and aid and support, be they NGOs or community groups or national spaces of safety and so forth. That's another layer where if someone has an intervention, it's an alternative. It's a place where someone can learn a different capacity. They can learn how to escape, or they can learn how to be guided. That's the group that you most likely will go to after law enforcement, or after you have family intervention or community or peer interventions. So those are layers. Now, in terms of, let's say, established referral pathways that exist, and they do exist, you do have immediate response being at the medical healthcare entry, the psychosocial entry, that is, of course, when things become affecting mental health, police and security, and legal information and assistance. How do you get them? Now, I can't give you numbers right now, but you go to the police, you go to the legal lawyers and so forth. It's nice to, again, inform the community. Once you have passed this immediate response, first responders, healthcare, social welfare and psychosocial, protection and safety, and law enforcement or legal and justice actors, you can then move on to associated services, i.e. support groups, places of safety, advocacy groups, help groups for different categories of survivors, be it in terms of sexual health or physical violence or workplace. If you're in a workplace, an organization might have a pathway already set. And so you follow that pathway in your organization. But fundamentally, I would say, if you are a bystander, a big part of your job is you have to evaluate the situation. Is there imminent danger? Is there a need to have an intervention? Is there a need for advice and conversation? What do you see happening? And from there, you go to your four main sources of help: healthcare, social welfare and psychosocial services, protection and safety actors, and law enforcement or legal and justice actors. Prior to these four, you can then turn to family, community, and peer groups that can serve as a pre-intervention to engage the person as a legitimate member in their own way to deal with and confront. Important as a bystander is non-judgmental intervention. No matter what you think about what is happening, who it's happening to, how wrong or how right or why you think it is, you have to reserve your judgment. You have to reserve your perspective. You have to reserve your feelings about things, and you act in the interest of the person you are trying to help. Of course, considering your own protection, because you don't want to put yourself in a site of vulnerability. Sometimes people enter into something in a very, I'm going to save the world, and this happens locally and internationally. That's not your purpose. That is, you see someone experiencing vulnerability. How can I help them? And if you can involve them in defining and designing that intervention, then give them that respect. So as I said, these are the parts you can take. They are there, and you help somebody through. If you can't do it yourself, you again seek these advocacy groups and so forth that can indeed help them.
Great. That has been quite an informative session. Thank you so much, Dr. Ann Barratt, for joining us today and sharing insight into how you can take a stand against gender-based violence in Trinidad and Tobago. Sign up to be notified for our next live show in the links. Check any links in the comments. If you're watching us on the replay, same thing. Don't worry, you'll get it straight directly to your email. As always, be sure to like us as well on YouTube and LinkedIn. And thank you so much for joining us for this show as well as the shows previously in 2021. Make sure to enjoy your holidays. I know it's not the most perfect setup, but let's use what we have and enjoy it. And I'll see you in 2022. Goodbye, everybody.